Pei is sponsored Lilu Nishmas Elio Zalman ben Yisachar Alevi. The sugya actually begins on Pei Daled Amud Beis. The subject is the source. How do we know one pays for causing someone pain even without injury, which is a din in our Mishnah? The pasuk in Shmos Perek Chaf Aleph pasuk Chaf Hey says Kviya tachas kviya, petza tachas petza, chabrua tachas chabrua. Now, there's a brisa that explains this pasuk, and the wording of the brisa is unclear. Rebbe interprets the verse as Kviya Nemar Tchila. Ben Azai says Chabura Nemar Tchila. What do these words mean? Kviya Nemar Tchila and Chabura Nemar Tchila. Rava comes along and explains the opinion of Ben Azai, meaning he is the Tana of our Mishnah who holds that one pays for pain alone even without injuring someone. Rebbe understands the verse as the mention of a burn separate from an injury to indicate that even without an injury one is liable. If so, why did the verse at the end have to mention injury, chabura tachas chabura, to indicate it as a qualification of the first part of the pasuk? That when the verse mentions a burn, for a burn, what it means to say is only where it's a compensation in addition to the injury. Whereas Ben Azai explains it in the opposite manner. He says the fact that the verse ends with a separate requirement to pay for injury indicates that pain is a separate liability. Rav Papa explains the argument in an opposite manner. The Gemara brings another explanation, whereas both opinions would hold that with an injury or without an injury, the perpetrator has to pay compensation for pain. And the argument over here is concerning a klal. How do we learn a klal and a prat? When we have something that separates the klal from the prat, can we darshan a klal and prat or not? Rebbe holds we cannot darshan a klal and prat, which is called the klal and prat ruchakim zeh mizeh, and therefore, since chabura is separate from kviya, it cannot come to qualify the verse. And therefore, he has to pay for pain without suffering. He has to pay for pain without injury. Ben Azai would hold that you can darshan a klal and prat, which are ruchakim zeh mizeh, and therefore you could learn that chabura, tachas chabura at the end of the verse does qualify the beginning of the verse, telling you that only where one suffers pain in addition to an injury is he liable to pay for the pain. Now, the next law of the Gemara is concerning the assessment for pain. Shmuel's father explains that we assess pain on the basis of a person who, for example, was sentenced by a government to have his limb amputated. How much would he pay to have it amputated in a less painful manner, as by way of a drug rather than by surgical means? According to the Rush, this assessment is regardless of whether there is an injury and he's paying in addition to the injury or not. The next point that the Gemara discusses is concerning sores that develop from the injury. If the sores developed as a result of the injury, according to all opinions, he pays medical expenses and loss of employment. If they developed as a result of excessive bandaging, the Tanna Kama holds he pays both, since one is dependent upon the other. If he is entitled to medical compensation, he is entitled to loss of employment compensation. And that is, how do we know, in fact, that he's entitled to medical compensation? We know from the fact that it says v'rapo yirape. The double expression includes even in a case where he was somewhat responsible for the development of the sores. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda holds no. Only medical compensation he's entitled to, but not loss of employment. According to the Chachamim Achronim, in the Brisa, he exempt from both payments as they depend on one another. Since he's not liable to unemployment because there is no double expression to obligate him in a case where he was somewhat responsible for his situation, he does not get medical compensation. If the sores develop not as a result of the injury, such as where he did not follow the doctor's advice, then the word rak exempts the perpetrator from pain. In a case where the perpetrator recommends a doctor, we have three situations. Even if he is a doctor himself, the victim can refuse his care. If he offers him a doctor for free, such as a relative of the perpetrator, the victim can refuse him also because a doctor that you don't pay is unreliable. The third situation is he offers him a doctor that is not from the vicinity, that also the victim is entitled to refuse. But on the other hand, if the victim asks him for payment and he'll find himself a doctor, that the perpetrator can refuse him because he is the one that has to arrange a doctor for him. The term in the verse Petza Tachas Potza teaches he pays for pain in addition to injury. The term Barapa Yurape teaches he pays medical expenses in addition to injury. Now, what are these cases that we're talking about of compensation without injury? How do you have pain without injury? So, as far as what we already discussed, pain without injury is where he burns his nail, for example, and doesn't permanently damage him. Medical expenses without injury are where the perpetrator gave him too strong a medication that whitened his skin. Loss of employment is where he locked him in a room and did nothing to him other than that. Embarrassment is where he spits in his face. Those cases he's compensated for them even though he's not injured. Loss of employment, he gets paid as a watchman for cucumbers. This compensation is appropriate even if he worked previously at a higher paying job because his compensation for injury will be appropriate to his loss. The evaluation is based on his capability after the injury. If in addition to, let's say for example, having his hand amputated, he also broke his foot, then he can't be a watchman for cucumbers because he can't move around. There, in that case, he would have to be a doorman. If, for example, he blinded him, he could not be a watchman. He could be only somebody who could possibly grind a millstone or some other similar activity. A deaf man gets full compensation since he cannot work, he cannot be instructed by anybody unless he does skilled work that he can return to.